I am General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant, and in my reflections today, I am going to look at the road to war. This is the first of a four-part series where I will look at the road to our Civil War. I have said that I think cooler heads should have prevailed, and I still feel that way. But there are a number of events that were stepping stones to the ultimate firing on Fort Sumter. I still think that cooler heads should have and could have prevailed. I have a list of steps in the road to war. This is not felt to be totally inclusive nor exhaustive. As you reflect upon this, you may think of other instances that were contributing factors. And my thoughts on these steps are not exhaustive, nor are they all inclusive. I merely intend to examine and look at significant events that led to the war. My reflections on that are: in 1789, the Constitution was approved. In 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was consummated. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise was passed. In 1833, the formation of the American Anti-Slave Society came about. In 1835, the infamous or famous gag rule was passed in Congress that lasted until 1844. In 1846 through 1848, we had the Mexican War. Also in 1846, the Wilmot Proviso was introduced and tied to the end of the Mexican War, but we'll look at that in a greater detail. In 1850, the Compromise of 1850 was introduced, and it was defeated. But also in 1850, President Zachary Taylor died, and he opposed the Compromise. Millard Fillmore then became the president, and he supported the Compromise. The omnibus bill originally introduced by Henry Clay failed, but Senator Douglas of Illinois picked up the momentum and broke the omnibus bill into 5 different parts. And all 5 passed with different majorities on each of the 5 parts. So the bill in total was defeated, but yet every part of the bill was passed. In 1852, the book Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, and popular sovereignty, while was not the first time it was brought to the fore, became a battle cry of sorts. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision was issued in St. Louis, Dred Scott versus Sanford, and I will talk about that at much greater length about the case and its results and ramifications and implications. In 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were held in Illinois. In 1859, John Brown raided the Harper's Ferry Armory with the most incendiary result. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president, and about a month later, before Lincoln can take office, South Carolina seceded and the secession began. In 1861, Fort Sumter was fired upon, April the 12th, and we had war. The incidents began with the Constitution approved in 1789, and it was a combination of compromises between slave and non-slave holding representatives in the Congress. And they approved the 2/3 majority of other people, which was a compromise for the less populated South, that they had many slaves, and they counted 3/5 of the slaves for representation in the House of Representatives. This greatly chafed the northern people, anti-slave representatives, because the blacks, the slaves, could not vote, yet they were being counted toward the voting population or representation in the House of Representatives. And they thought this was a great oxymoron that should not have been. And there was provision for capturing runaway slaves. It also outlawed banned the importation of slaves in 1808. So even as the Constitution is approved, they put in place the cessation of the importing of slaves. So there are many opposites in the Constitution. But in 1789, we began our country with controversy over slaves. In 1793, the first Fugitive Slave Act was passed because the Constitution did not provide for the Southerners enough safeties in place to provide for runaway slaves. And among other things, it denied slaves all constitutional rights, particularly trial by jury. Couldn't represent themselves, couldn't testify, no trial by jury. If they were caught, they were doomed, and almost completely in every case to be carried back south. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase is completed. Now, this was greatly significant in our history because it approximately doubled the size of our country. 800,000 square miles of territory for $15 million, about 3 cents an acre. And it ran from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, and from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Most of that territory unexplored. But it also really started the great controversy about, are we going to have slaves in this new territory? Or is slavery going to be extended into the new territory? The anti-slavery people were bitter about, no, it will not be extended. In the South, pro-slavery folks were equally bitter or emphatic that yes, it would be continued. So the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country approximately, and the hue and cry over slavery really began to rise into the crescendo that it ultimately became. In 1818, Missouri Territory applied to become a state. This was cataclysmic for the anti-slave people because Missouri wanted to come into the Union as a slave state. Up to this point, from the founding of the country, 1789 with the Constitution, to 1818, there has been a balance. At this point, that we've got 11 slave states and 11 free states. I would call you to mind of the compromise of our two-house government. And it was a compromise because The Senate has 2 senators from every state. The House is based upon the population. Hence, the 3/5 compromise of slaves in the South because of the lesser population. And also, one house is equal in votes from every state. But with the introduction of Missouri, would be the 12th slave state. And it would upset the balance in the Senate, certainly, and in the House as well, with more pro-slave people. There was much to do about this, and one result of it was that the state of Maine was carved out of the state of Massachusetts and joined the Union as a free state. So the balance was maintained in the Senate and counteracted in the House of Representatives. And in 1820, Missouri was introduced as a slave state, and Maine came in as a free state. But when, and that was the Missouri Compromise. When Thomas Jefferson heard about this, that it had been signed into law, he wrote a friend just days after the president signed it into law and said, I quote, "The Missouri question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the death knell of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. A geographical line coinciding with a marked principle, moral or political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper." End quote. He was talking about the compromise being Missouri was admitted as a slave state. Now remember, it's the first state to come into the Union from part of that Louisiana Purchase back in 1803. At last, we've got a state or a territory from the Louisiana Purchase to join the Union, and it's a slave state. Of course, as I have already addressed, Maine came in as a free state. But another facet of this issue was Maine came in as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, but a line was drawn at 36:30, 36 degrees latitude, 30 minutes, and above that line, which is the southern border of Missouri, the line was drawn from the Mississippi River west all the way to the ocean. That line, 3630, was the southern border of the state of Missouri. Missouri was admitted as an exception as a slave state, but all the territory going all the way to Canada and to the Rocky Mountains, by far the larger part of the Louisiana Purchase, was never to have slavery. Never, the word never used. The Southerners were unhappy with that because they felt it's unconstitutional to limit slavery in this territory that was purchased with United States funds and is part of the United States. You can't prohibit slavery in the new territory. It's unconstitutional. And the free folks were unhappy because it allowed a slave state into the Union. And the Southerners were also happy because they'd gotten another state and they had lifted slavery to the fore and pushed it into prominence as part of the new states being formed from the Louisiana Territory. So while nobody was very happy with the Missouri Compromise, everybody was at least on a stable basis for the moment. So was it unconstitutional to limit slavery in the Louisiana Territory? Litigation has been introduced about that, or was introduced about that, but that's where the controversy really began. That territory north of the southernmost border of Missouri, all of the Louisiana Purchase was never to have slavery except for Missouri. Is that constitutional or not? And the march to the war picked up momentum. In 1832 in South Carolina, we had the Nullification Crisis, as it was called, and oddly enough, it was not over slavery. It was over a tariff. But the South Carolinians said that we can nullify legislation passed by the United States government. If we don't like it, we'll nullify it. If we don't like the law, we don't have to abide by it. And that's when the first real talk of a secession movement began. They said, South Carolina said, if we don't go with the law, we don't like it, we won't obey it. The national government says, yes, you will. And South Carolina said, we'll just leave the Union. So the Nullification Crisis over a tariff, not over slavery, introduced the first serious talk of secession and leaving the Union. In 1833, rather quietly, a new organization was formed in America, and it was called the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, since the Constitution was approved and into the 1800s, there had been people that were always irritated with slavery. Now they're forming official groups, and their voices are being raised and being heard more loudly, and they've gone from we don't like it to we are outraged by slavery. And by the 1850s, the numbers of anti-slavery groups and people raising their voices grew considerably. But 1833 saw the formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society. In 1835, the House of Representatives passed the gag rule. And the gag rule was official policy passed in Congress, law, that no one could even bring up the issue in Congress of slavery. Couldn't even bring it up, couldn't be mentioned on the floor. This lasted until about 1844. Not surprisingly, James K. Polk was the Speaker of the House when this came to pass. He'll be mentioned in just a moment. But the gag rule went from about 1835 to about 1844, and finally that was ended. Some calling it nonsense, some people saying it should be continued, but it was ended after about 9-10 years. It ran almost a decade. In 1846 through 1848, we have the Mexican War. Now that goes back to Texas independence in 1836, becoming a territory, wanting to become a state. President Polk, James K. Polk, comes into office with his touting of manifest destiny of our country going from sea to shining sea, past the Louisiana Purchase, and that it was our destiny, manifest destiny, that we should occupy the entire continent. Many people wanted the entire North American continent occupied, Mexico and Canada, as well as our contiguous land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But President Polk was elected pretty much on a platform of starting a war with Mexico. And Texas wanted much more territory than what it had and what it ultimately got. Mexico lost about a third of its total area, and in fact, Mexico lost a third of its area, and we gained essentially the states of California, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona, and much more besides those states. But we had the Mexican War. It was opposed by people who were concerned that any lands that we got would be slave states, and the anti-slave representation was opposed to that. In fact, Polk was accused of starting a war just to get more slave territory, slave states into the Union, because Mexico was to the south. So it was felt geographically as well as politically that any territory that we got was going to become slave states, and that was bitterly opposed. I was personally opposed to the Mexican War. I think that President Polk poked, to make a pun, if I might, Mexico until he finally got a war. And I think that it was, and it said, if I had the moral courage to resign my commission from the Army, I would have. But I did not have that moral courage to resign. I was opposed to the war. I am still opposed to the Mexican War. I felt that the Mexican War was the most unjust war ever waged by a stronger country against a weaker one, and that indeed our American Civil War is our providential retribution for having started and fought the Mexican War. Strong words perhaps, but they come from strong feelings that I fervently held then and just as fervently hold now. But in 1846, a Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot wrote what became known as the Wilmot Proviso. And while I will not go into great depth on it, I urge you to do so. Mr. Wilmot attached a rider to the bill for $2 million for reparations to Mexico and to rebuild Mexico from the destruction of the war that we had fought there. He tied the proviso in there with that bill to stipulate that no territory gained from the Mexican War would ever become a slave state. Now, this lit a fire. And of course, the pro-slave people in the country were outraged, and the anti-slave folks were outraged, that the pro-slave folks were outraged, and we began our first real serious talk of war. But it was not passed. It passed in the House, never passed in the Senate. Mr. Wilmot attached it to the original appropriations bill. That bill did not pass. It was reintroduced. It was passed in the House, failed in the Senate. Another appropriations bill for reparations to Mexico was introduced with the Wilmot Proviso. It too passed and failed in the Senate, but the Senate wrote a Senate version of it eliminating the Wilmot Proviso, and that is the bill that passed with war reparations for Mexico. So the Wilmot Proviso, while it seems to have slipped from public consciousness and awareness, the Wilmot Proviso was a significant piece of legislation and a step in the road to war, of which more people should be aware. In 1850, January the 29th of 1850, Henry Clay introduced into Congress the Compromise of 1850, what became known as the Compromise of 1850. It was an omnibus bill, sizable indeed, that addressed the issues of California coming into the Union, because California had applied for statehood in 1849 as a free state. This added fuel to the firestorm, because that would be a state gained through the Mexican War. It was a state that was coming in as a free state. There was no commensurate balancing slave state to come in. What was to be done? And they were pressing hard to come into the Union. So the pressure is building to an explosive level. Clay introduced the Compromise of 1850 that addressed California being admitted as a free state, addressed the border or the land claims of Texas. Texas was claiming land that went as far north as Santa Fe, New Mexico, as part of Texas. It was not in the boundaries we know of it now. They wanted much more territory from the Mexican War. Clay's second part of Clay's 1850 bill addressed that and war reparations. It went on other parts of the bill. There were 5 different parts, and I will address all 5 parts in our second review about the road to war. It's not appropriate to go that far now. So in summary, the first part of the road to war was the Constitution in 1789 with all the compromises in it. The first Fugitive Slave Act in 1793, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the 1820 Missouri Compromise, the 1832 Nullification Crisis, 1833 formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society, 1835 the gag rule, where one couldn't even speak about slavery on the floors of Congress, 1846 through 48 the Mexican War, 1846 the Wilmot Proviso, and then in 1850 the Compromise of 1850, which initially failed, but later was passed in all 5 parts with different majorities for each part. But as a single bill, one bill, it failed. With all 5 parts broken up, it passed. Another marvel in our political machinery or political activity. But that's quite enough for this meeting, coming together in my reflections on the road to war, part 1. There will be 3 other parts wherein I will discuss the Dred Scott case and other issues that led to the war. But for the moment, I will bring these remarks to a close. And until we come together again, I'm General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you farewell.